Hypervisor. In this section, we will get into the details of a hypervisor. As part of this section, we will define what a hypervisor is, and then we'll compare and contrast different types of hypervisors, namely type 1 and type 2 hypervisor. And then we'll look at hypervisor software vendors, different vendors that are there in the marketplace that are providing type 1 and type 2 hypervisors, including open source vendors. Then we will also look at hypervisor from an installation perspective. So what is a hypervisor? A hypervisor, simply put, is a piece of software that allows several operating systems to share a single hardware host. As you can see on the right hand side, we have a single hardware server. That server has its CPU, RAM, NIC card, hard drive. But then there is also this software that's running on top of that particular hardware, directly on top of the hardware, in this case, called the hypervisor, which used to be called VMM. If you recall, in the 1960s and 70s, when Popek and Goldberg published their paper on hypervisors, actually at that point, they used to call it VMM, which is the virtual machine monitor, which is what we call today a hypervisor. So the modern name for virtual machine monitor is the hypervisor. This is the piece of software that is time slicing the different resources that's in the hardware so that multiple virtual machines can run, and each virtual machine is being abstracted to run its own operating system. And that's really what a hypervisor is. Hypervisor is the modern name for virtual machine monitor. Each operating system appears to have the host processor, memory, resources to itself. They all think that the hardware is their own hardware, right? That's what the hypervisor makes it look like. The hypervisor is controlling the host resources and processors and actually time slicing between these different virtual machines. That's really what the hypervisor is really doing, although the virtual machines are really thinking that they have the hardware to themselves. Why is it called the hypervisor? Well, back in the day, the term supervisor was used for the operating system. The term hypervisor was used for code that utilized memory not accessible to programmers. These were some special calls that they would make in order to make the most out of memory. And that piece of software used to be called the hypervisor. Today, hypervisor is making efficient use of system resources like the CPU, the RAM, the network storage, everything. And so the term hypervisor is being utilized. Although I would say supervisor would have been a better name because it's really supervising all the operating systems, but it's called the hypervisor. Now, throughout this particular course, I will be using the term VMM or hypervisor. When I say VMM, which is the virtual machine monitor as defined by Goldberg and Popek, or virtual machine manager or hypervisor, they're all the same thing. When it comes to hypervisor, there are a couple of other terms that we should understand. One is called host. Host is the physical server running the hypervisor server, and guest is the virtual machine hosted by the hypervisor. And so sometimes you get into this story of host versus guest, host operating system versus guest operating system. That's another term that gets used in terms of type 2 hypervisors. All I want you to remember at this point is that host is the physical server and guest is the virtual machine. There are two types of hypervisors in the marketplace. There is the type 1 hypervisor and then the type 2 hypervisor. Let's look at type 1 hypervisor. In type 1 hypervisor, you have the hardware and then the hypervisor software is running directly on top of the hardware. So it's running directly on the host hardware. This is also called a native hypervisor or a bare metal hypervisor because it's running natively on the hardware. In this case, the guest operating system is running on a level above the hypervisor, of course, and the hypervisor is acting as a manager for all the guest operating systems. This is a classic implementation of VM architecture in cloud data centers. So directly on top of the hardware, you're installing the hypervisor. There is also another kind of hypervisor, which is called the type 2 hypervisor. It's also called the hosted hypervisor because it requires an operating system. So the way this hypervisor works is that you have your hardware and then you put an operating system on that particular hardware. It could be Windows, it could be your Mac OS, it could be Linux, it could be anything. And then on top of the operating system, you install the hypervisor software and then you run the operating systems or the VMs inside the hypervisor software. So you have the hardware and then the host operating system, and then you install the hypervisor, which is the type 2 hypervisor, as an application, and then inside the application is where you run different VMs. This is what we call a type 2 hypervisor. Let's look at some of the founding hypervisor software. There are two major founding hypervisor projects. One is called KVM. You can go and find more information about it at linuxkvm.org. It's an open source GPL license model hypervisor. It's Linux-based virtualization software, and it has been ported to many flavors of Unix, including Windows. So that's KVM. There is also another hypervisor, which is called Zen, which is under zenproject.org. That is the official site for that. That is also an open source virtualization software. And it's also been ported to many flavors of Unix and Windows. It's developed by University of Cambridge as an open source project, and it's on GPL license. So these are two major flavors of hypervisors that are there in the marketplace. There are other hypervisor software. You can find a complete list of those right here at this Wikipedia site. And here are some of the examples of other hypervisors that's there in the marketplace. The big difference between all these different hypervisors are there's a difference between commercial versus open source. Whether it's commercial or open source, they have in some form or the other borrowed from either the Zen project or the KVM project. In terms of type 1 commercial hypervisors, there are four major ones. That's the VMware vSphere ESXi. There is also the Microsoft Hyper-V. Then there is Citrix Xen Server. There is also Red Hat Enterprise Virtualization RHEV. These are the four major vendors that's there in the marketplace. Many data centers use these commercial hypervisors. But then if you look at cloud providers such as Amazon and Google, they have their own custom implementation of hypervisors too. So they don't use many of these commercial ones. Now they may have taken some of the open source ones and made some modifications on the open source ones to create their own internal one, but these are the commercial ones available in the marketplace. The difference between free and commercial is that most software is based on open source Zen, but they also offer it for free. If you go to VMware, you'll see that you can actually download VMware ESXi and download it and install it. You will get the hypervisor, but the real value behind a hypervisor is the hypervisor client, which allows you to install virtual machines remotely, which allows you to move a virtual machine from one server to another server, which allows you to scale with dynamic scaling, all kinds of features. That's what is missing. And the reason they do this is because most of the hypervisors actually are some variation of the Zen open source hypervisor, and they want to kind of give back to the open source community, and so they give you the software for free, but then the management software is where they actually charge you money. Now let's talk about type 2 hypervisors. Type 2 hypervisors, like I mentioned, are hypervisor software that are installed on top of an operating system. So if you're already running Mac operating system and if you want to run Windows on top of it, you may want to install a type 2 hypervisor and then install Windows on top of that. So that's the classic use of a type 2 hypervisor. There are several type 2 hypervisor software in the marketplace. There is the VMware Workstation, which is a paid software. There is also Microsoft Hyper-V, which comes with Windows 8. You just have to turn it on. There's also Oracle VirtualBox, which is what I use, and there's an assignment that you'll be doing in this module where you'll be using the VirtualBox open source software. That's a free version of it. So that's what we'll be using. Once again, the type 2 hypervisor is something that you install on top of your operating system. So you have your hardware, and then you have your operating system, then you install the type 2 hypervisor like VirtualBox, and then you install operating system inside the type 2 hypervisor. Right? So let's talk about the installation. In terms of installation, when it comes to the type 1 hypervisor, you typically install it in a data center environment. So you don't really install it in your desktop. These are your blade servers. These are your 1U servers, the typical rack servers. That's where you install a type 1 hypervisor. Install it on servers, not on desktops in a data center environment. And when you install, you typically get no GUI or limited GUI. So you'll install the hypervisor and then you get nothing. All you'll end up getting is probably some kind of a command line interface. And then maybe at most it'll show you some basic IP information because it may have talked to DHCP and gotten an IP address. That's about it. But it may have a service running which can be invoked through GUI or REST protocol. Remember I said to you, in type 1 hypervisor, you have a server. On top of it, you put the hypervisor, and then you have to install the VM on top of that, or the virtual machines on top of it, the operating systems on top of that. But in order to do that, what you would need is some kind of a client software, which is your management software, and then you would use the management software to go in and install operating systems on these different servers that may be in data centers. That's the installation process for a type 1 hypervisor. Now, we are not going to be installing a type 1 hypervisor in this class, although I want to tell you that cloud providers already have servers with type 1 hypervisors in it. What I want you to understand how the internals of cloud is working. When you say you want to provision a server, this is what they're doing. They actually have some management software that is going in and launching a server on the fly by communicating with the hypervisors. That's the gist that I want you to take from hypervisor discussions. So what is the type 1 hypervisor use case? You basically virtualize your data center for ease of management. And what you're really doing is you're taking your infrastructure hardware and putting a hardware and a software separation on top of that. What do I mean by this? Let's look at it. Now let's look at VMware ESXi Type 1 hypervisor in action within a data center. Like I said, VMware ESXi is a Type 1 hypervisor. What you're seeing here is a data center where there is one server, although you can have many servers. And you also have another server that's running what is called the vCenter server software, which is a part of the vSphere management suite. And then you have a desktop machine. You can see your desktop machine and vCenter server software and the actual server where you're going to be running VMs all connected together. Using your desktop, using your vSphere client, you can authenticate to the vCenter server, which is the server administration service or software. Or you can use your desktop using your browser. You can connect to the vCenter server administration software, and then you can control the ESXi virtualizing environment by installing new operating systems or new virtual machines on your servers. So the idea here is that once a server is installed inside your data center, you don't really have to go and physically install an operating system. You can do it remotely using these different software. And that's really what VMware is providing you. That is exactly what is going on in data centers, or in cloud data centers to be precise, where they have some kind of a management console that allows you to launch VMs on the fly. So now you're seeing how all that magic is taking place. Here is the traditional data center where you have storage, network, servers, network, more servers, network, storage. You have these servers which are physical servers that have their operating systems installed. What you can do is modernize it. And when you modernize it using something like VMware ESXi or any one of these other Type 1 hypervisor software, what you're really doing is you have your compute nodes or compute machines, you have your networking gear, you have your storage gear, all those things are connected. This is your hardware layer, and you have your software layer, which is really your virtual machines and the various software that is running on top of those virtual machines. So there's a nice separation within a data center between compute, storage, and network as the infrastructure. That's your IaaS, and this is your clients accessing your IaaS. As you can see, this is how the data centers are becoming modernized, and now this is actually taking us into cloud computing, and you're really beginning to see the coming of the infrastructure as a service. Now let's talk about installing a Type 2 hypervisor. When it comes to Type 2 hypervisor, like I said, all you have to do is install it on top of the desktop. So you have your Mac or your Windows machine, you just download something like Oracle VirtualBox, install it, and then you run your operating system within that. What I'm going to show you here is a screenshot of VirtualBox running in my operating system, in my Mac operating system, and I have one virtual machine that's already saved over here. I also can launch new virtual machines. I can discard an existing virtual machine and things like that. So let me go ahead and quickly show you my VirtualBox. Here's VirtualBox running on my machine. As you can see, this is running as an application on my Mac. There are 3 operating systems, or to be precise, 3 VMs I have actually launched. One is called Saraswati, which is in a paused state, saved state. There is another one called CentOS 6.4 that is also in the saved state. And there is one operating system that is powered off. If I want to power on an operating system, I can simply double click on it and the operating system will power on. As you can see right here, the operating system is launching in a separate window. All this is happening in my desktop, in my Mac machine. I'm launching the server is booting up. This is the example of a Type 2 hypervisor. Now, we don't really deal with it in a data center environment, but I just wanted to show you how it works. In this case, I've already installed CentOS 6.2. Let me log in. And so really in this particular case, what I'm doing, oops, that was the login failure. Let me go ahead and log in again. My password was wrong. What you're seeing in this case is me having my Mac. On top of Mac, I have the Mac OS. On top of Mac OS, I have VirtualBox. On top of VirtualBox, I've installed a virtual machine called HD Server, and there it is. And I can launch terminal within that. So this is a virtual machine, which is a full-fledged UI CentOS operating system. But you can also launch virtual machines, which are simplified implementation of Unix, where all you get is a terminal. You could also do that, which is what you'll be doing as assignment in this module. I also wanted to show you that you can actually pause this. I can click on this, I can power off the machine, or I can save the state of the machine. So really what I'm doing is taking my virtual machine and storing its state as a file. And so when I launch it, it'll come back to the same state. If I double click on it, it'll come back to the same state. You'll see all these things. You'll be doing all these things as part of infrastructure as a service in AWS Cloud. But now you can start seeing how these things are working. All right, let me go ahead. I can also power off. I'm powering it off right now. I can also go to an existing VM and launch it. In this case, I'm launching another VM, which was already powered off right here. It came up in a different window. So let me go ahead and bring it in right there. I'll go ahead and close that. And I'll go ahead and set it in the pause state. There it is. I'm pausing it. You get the idea here. You can also create a new virtual machine, but then you have to install the operating system. Like I said, that's what you'll be doing as part of your assignment, so you get some idea as to how hypervisors work. That's the best we can do because it's much more complicated to install a Type 1 hypervisor. Okay, so Type 2 hypervisor, as you can see, are installed on top of an existing operating system. And the only reason you do that is because you need to run some specialized specific program. For example, sometimes I like to test my website on IE. In that case, I end up launching Windows on my Mac and then running IE within that. Sometimes you may want to run legacy applications, maybe a 32-bit application and a 64-bit machine. So in such case also, you may want to launch another virtual machine and then use it. So Type 2 hypervisors are not really used in cloud data centers. It's more Type 1 hypervisors. And one of the primary reasons is because Type 1 hypervisors, since they run directly on hardware, it's more performant. In summary, we learned that a hypervisor is really a modern name for the virtual machine manager or the virtual machine monitor as defined by Popek and Goldberg. There are two types of hypervisors, Type 1 and Type 2. Type 1 is also called the bare metal or native hypervisor because it runs on top of the hardware. It runs directly on the hardware and it's used for data center management and cloud. Type 2 hypervisor is also called a hosted hypervisor. It needs an operating system underneath. It is used to run other operating systems on top of existing operating system, maybe for testing purposes, for development purposes, or even running some specialized operating system. In terms of hypervisor software, Type 1 hypervisor software, we have VMware ESXi, Microsoft Hyper-V, Citrix Xen Server, 3 market leaders. Type 2, we have VMware Workstation, Microsoft Hyper-V, and VirtualBox.